This is Scott Richmond.
And Arnie Sherman.
You're listening to What Do You Know on Newstalk KGVO, AM 1290 and 98.3 FM. Arnie Sherman, good morning. It's a big one.
Good morning, Scott. To our listeners, Scott's saying it's a big one because normally when we do our show, we have very interesting guests and we do our homework, but we often kind of wing it. You know, we're casual and relaxed. But this week, I believe we're playing way above our weight. And we have a daunting task in interviewing Joan Juliet Buck, the writer, editor, actor, fashion icon. I mean, she's not only...
She's a good get.
Well, she's a great get for the show, but she's also has interviewed some of the most important, interesting, and fascinating people in the world.
Yeah.
So she's not only an author, she has a new book out that's getting great reviews called The Price of Illusion, her memoir about her life on Atria Books. But she was the editor of Glamour. She worked for Women's Wear Daily, Vogue, Vanity Fair, Condé Nast, Harper's Bazaar, New Yorker. And in the capacity of writing and editing, she has covered a landscape that is stunning. It's almost a virtuosity landscape of people, places, and things. Yeah. I mean, she interacted in her life with so many of the, elite of the art and culture world. People like, Tom Wolfe and Peter O'Toole was her father's business partner at Keep Films.
Right.
Her best friend was Angelica Houston and Manola Blahnik.
Right, and then Paloma Picasso.
Right, and Leonard Cohen. She had relationships with Leonard Cohen and Jerry Brown and Donald Sutherland and Karl Lagerfeld and many, many others. I mean, Halston designed her wedding gown when she got married. So, I mean, she has been through a lot of things and has had a career that, she's a subject of a short story that Tom Wolfe wrote. About her. And
she inspired a short story.
Yeah.
And an accomplished actress, too.
So we have somebody of that caliber and stature on our show today, and hopefully our listeners will find it as interesting as we do. I just read her book, 421 pages of memoir, and it was fascinating. It was witty, it was detailed, it was glamorous, and it was unforgettable and unforgiving at the same time. That's the way I saw it.
Is this like I'm with the band for a new age? Like, remember Pamela Zavar, right?
Yeah, this is more detailed because she kept diaries. And
Joan did.
Yeah, so she started writing about her life at 4 years of age with remarkable detail. I mean, I can remember
4 years of age.
Yeah, 4 years of age when she moved to Paris at 4.
Where was she born?
In Los Angeles.
So give us some quick bio so we don't bother her with the specifics. Where is she? Born in L.A.
Born in L.A., moved with her father and mother to Paris, learned French before she learned English as a language.
Yeah.
Was immersed in culture because of the father was a movie producer, produced many of Peter O'Toole's great movies, was involved with him before he became a star.
Right.
And at the time when Lawrence of Arabia was being produced, and then went on to produce a number of his films. Her godfather was John Huston, the great Hollywood director,
right,
who was served in the military with her father, was his commanding officer and colleague and friend during World War II. She started getting involved in fashion at a young age, and by the age of 23, she was a featured editor at Vogue magazine.
Do you know who she worked for before she worked at Vogue? Let me see what your retention level is.
Well, she worked in so many places at so many times.
But her first publishing job
was with
the guy who's in the news these days.
Who?
Rupert Murdoch.
Oh, that's Rupert Murdoch. Yes. Yeah. Well, she worked for Condé Nast, and so she had a lot of connections. She used to lunch regularly with Jackie Onassis. That's an interesting connection there.
I'll ask her. We'll ask her that. She's Jackie Onassis, by the way. When I worked at Bertelsmann and Random House,
right.
She's an editor at Random House.
Right.
She used to eat with us in the cafeteria.
Yeah, she was not as.
She had a bodyguard on her at all times.
Right.
But she was, of the people.
So she became sort of the symbol of mod, in the 60s in Paris and London. She was going back and forth, Paris and London. Her family would hold court and have all of these famous art and culture icons hanging around, and that's the environment she grew up and flourished in.
Yeah,
and then moved on, and probably, unfortunately for some people, her biggest claim to fame of late was she did an interview for Vogue in 2011 of
Assad. Assad's wife.
Assad's wife called her the Rose of the Desert, and just got killed for doing that.
We'll ask Joan about that. It's safe to say Joan has never eaten at an Ollie's or a town pump. Is that right?
I don't think she's gotten a corn dog at a gas station as lunch. Part of the thing of reading the book, it makes you hungry because she's
talks about food.
Well, she's eating. She's cooking food for large groups of people, and she's going to every famous restaurant in Paris and New York and wherever she was living at the time.
Yeah.
But she became the first American editor of French Vogue magazine. And they treated her very poorly at the beginning because they thought she was sent in by corporate to kill everyone, wipe them out. But she wasn't. She was sent in to make it a better publication, and she did that.
She was of the people.
Right. So that's a little bit of background. I don't want to give any more away. That's probably as much as we need to share with our listeners as we get ready to talk to Joan Juliet Buck.
That's right, Joan Juliet Buck here on What Do You Know, proudly supported by Dawn Maddox, Glacier Sotheby's International Realty. She'll feel at home here with that. Back after this. We're back with our guest, Joan Juliet Buck, and her book, The Price of Illusion. Well, how long has this been in the works, Joan? How long have you, been working on this?
Oh, God, I started it, when did I meet you? Like 2007?
Yes.
Yeah. So I started it in 2011, but certain stories in it, like the story of Ava, I've been trying to write since 1969, which is a heartbreaking story.
Yes.
And I sat down in 2011 to write a certain part in the book that was. I mean, my life was full of mysteries. My big question was, what was all that? What happened? Why does everyone want to meet the former editor-in-chief of Paris Vogue? And I keep saying, no, that's not really me. It was miscasting. I kept squirming. And then the next question was, well, why do you squirm about who you've been and what you've done? What is that about? So there was a lot of self-examination.
Well, there was also the part about Jules, your dad, and how that came and went in the book. Because in some ways, it didn't seem like you could do it all at once. You had to you had to focus on it and then talk about other things and then come back to it.
Well, yeah, talk about intensity.
Wow. Yes.
I mean, bottom line, the first draft was over 1,000 pages. I had to write it like a deposition because when you're trying to find out what happened, you want all the facts.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so that took about 2 years, and then I spent the next 3.5, 4 years taking out what wasn't the story. And the more I took things out, the more I realized that the real story was my father's influence on me.
Sure. And you can see that come out in many various ways.
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple of questions to ask you, though, right off the bat.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that jumped out at me at the very beginning of reading the book was that you made a comment about colors or flavors to you.
Yeah.
So what does that really mean? I was trying to get to the essence of that, and I couldn't really grab it.
There's a condition that I pretend I have, but I don't think I really have it, called synesthesia. People who think that, numbers have colors and stuff like that. I don't have that, but I see color probably not like everybody else, or maybe everybody does, they just don't realize it. And like I'm looking at a suitcase right now that's hot pink, and it's so sweet. It's cloyingly sweet. It is nauseating to look at this pink.
Wow. That's really an interesting sensory, comparison.
Yeah, it's a thing. There's I've just moved into this house. There's a lot of books on the floor. The red books are jumping out at me, and they're like they're like traffic lights or police sirens.
Mm-hmm.
And where are you living now, Joan?
I live in Rhinebeck. I mean, we all left the city. Scott, when did you leave the city?
2013.
Wow, you just couldn't. You just didn't want any more of that, right?
It was. I was done.
Yeah.
So this is a nice place to come. You've been here, though, haven't you, to Montana?
Yeah, that was it. That was in the book when
Right.
Angelica was living with Jack Nicholson, and Jack Nicholson was shooting Missouri Break.
Right, he shot that in Montana.
Yeah, in Billings, and I spent my first American summer in Billings, Montana, which was quite a shock after Milan. I went to one night I said I'd cook dinner, and we went to this giant supermarket. I can't remember what it was called. And I go over to the huge meat department at the end, and I say, I'd like eight veal cutlets. And they look at me and they say, veal? We don't kill them that young.
You can't get veal here.
Yeah, you can't get it here.
Yeah, exactly. So I was like, I was being very chic and Italian. What do you mean? I only know how to cook veal, you know?
Right. So that brings up the point. I mean, you said your first American summer, you were whisked away to Paris when you were 4 years old, and you learned French.
3, yeah.
Yeah, when you learned French before you learned English. So do you still feel French inside?
It's very complicated. When I writing the book, most of the nouns and verbs came out in French. And thank God for the Internet, because I would just look up the English, and, it was simpler than going to the dictionary. That's the language I think in. I don't write in French particularly well, but I certainly think in French. And the thing is, what tripped me up in Paris when I was the editor of Paris Vogue, I'd been given the job because my French is quote unquote perfect. It's not really. But I'm not a French person inside, so I don't know how to scheme. I don't know how to manipulate. I don't know how to politic. I'm really very bad at backstabbing. I've never managed it.
Well, you were in the wrong business then.
Yeah, I know. Well, when you're just a writer, you're sort of safe, but these important jobs are very dangerous.
Yes. Let me ask you this. So you get this job, and then you went around, as you mentioned in the book, talking to your editor friends.
Yeah.
And asking their advice about taking on this new job. So what was the best advice you got?
The advice was wildly contradictory, and the best advice that I really listened to. Everything the editor-in-chief friend said was contradictory and was based on their being career editors who had striven for their jobs and fought for them and were going to keep them. And, they were alpha editors. I was this sort of beta writer creature. So it was very difficult to integrate any of their advice. And, of course, Alex Lieberman, the grand old art director, creative director of all of Condé Nast, saying to me, beware visions of loveliness, was a real downer, because I thought if you do Vogue, you're making visions of loveliness. Trying to think of best advice. There was a woman who edited a magazine called View on Color, which, of course, was my favorite magazine, because it was about colors.
Color.
And she said, just listen to your instinct. And I was such a writing machine. I was such a Condé Nast writing machine that for me, the word instinct was like, it brought up an image of a leopard jumping on a bunny and and eating it. And I said, well, what's the instinct? She said, well, it's like when you sort of know you should take an umbrella. So I kept trying to listen to my instinct. And finally, I mean, it's taken me all these years, call it 20 years, to get to understanding my instinct. What the most useful thing was something that I found out myself. And again, this is not something that normal editors do. If I planned a story or a fashion shoot or a reportage to please an advertiser or to pay off some kind of, debt of politeness, it was always a disaster.
Right.
Because the thing didn't have real energy behind it. It had lip service energy behind it. And lip service energy is crap.
Right.
And so I realized, as the years went by, okay, I've got to really feel it, or somebody around me has to be passionate about doing this, and then we can go for it. But if they just go, yeah, right, I'll shoot the girls.
Well, I thought the part of the book, which I thought it was very funny, and the way you described it. You're coming in as the first American editor of French Vogue ever, and since none since. And after you read it, you find out that they kind of think you're coming in from corporate to really be a
clean house,
Exactly.
and they give you that office that doesn't have a chair and it's the size of a kid's bedroom. I can imagine what you must have been thinking right at that spot at that time.
If I had been more of a diva, if I'd been a real editor-in-chief, I'd have made a phone call and said, I'm going back to the hotel until you find me a proper chair, because that's the way an alpha editor behaves.
Mm-hmm.
But because I'm a writer, a writer is nose to the grindstone. A writer knows exactly has a very sharp but a very limited focus.
Right.
So I thought, there's no chair. I have to find a chair. Nobody's getting me a chair. I'm going to find a chair.
Right.
And I went off to the art department of the Car magazine, and there was this miserable broken chair sitting in a corner. And there's the line I love that is in the book, but of course it happened, where I look at the chair and I start to pick it up, and one of the guys in the art department says, no, I'll carry it.
Yeah. That was at least nice of him. So let me ask you about the writing part of things. You've written about and interviewed a number of amazing people, Daniel Day-Lewis to, everybody in the art world, Karl Lagerfeld, others. What was the toughest person to interview for you? Who was?
The people who are impossible to interview are business people and politicians. And the single worst interview of my entire life was with Gianni Agnelli,
mm-hmm.
who was then the head of Fiat, the most glamorous and richest man in Italy. And I was working for Women's Wear Daily. And he was invulnerable, because when you're doing an interview, the only way it works is if there's a connection between you and the person. And if the subject has a vulnerable side, an open side, then you can get in and, you're not grilling them, but you actually have you know how to do this. You're having a conversation.
Right.
But if you're talking to somebody who is only going to advance the company agenda and talk about how wonderful everything is and what their profits are, you're listening to dead air.
Right.
They're not even speaking. It's PR speak.
Right.
We hate that.
It's PR speak. So, industrialists, bankers, all those people, impossible to talk to.
I mean, I love reading, interviews and articles. I mean, you've written for Glamour and, Women's Wear Daily.
When I was a baby.
Right, yes, but still you wrote for them. Vogue, Vanity Fair, Harper's Bazaar, New Yorker. Let me ask you this. Is the magazine business dying or dead?
It's really interesting what's happening with the magazine, because, of course, magazines are the primitive form of social media.
Right.
In the old days, you had to be hired and tested and tried and, also educated by experience to be one of the mediators of culture. You couldn't just suddenly start writing about stuff or interviewing people or being a critic without passing through all these gates to get into a publication. Nowadays, everybody can express themselves because of social media.
Right.
And in the old days, you went to a newsstand to find out what's going on.
Right.
And you remember, and you bought Rolling Stone, and you bought Newsweek, and you bought Harper's and the New Republic. I don't know. What did you guys buy?
No, it was harder to get. You had to actually get out of your chair to get it, and you sought it out. And
after I left New York, I got New Yorker because I wanted to stay in touch with what was going on. That was the pulse, I look forward to getting to the New Yorker to read the theater reviews and the movie reviews and the articles and Woody Allen's. Every once in a while Woody Allen would write a piece, and that was great. But it doesn't serve the same purpose anymore because you have lots of other ways to get that information.
Exactly. So what's happening now? First of all, aren't you reading New York Magazine? Because that's the best magazine out there.
Yes, I read New York Magazine.
Right,
also.
it's the best written.
Yes.
Well, but New York Magazine fulfills a real function because it actually gives you the pulse of the moment, and nobody is in there sort of showing off. They're actually reporting on today, right now, and Adam Moss is an extraordinary editor. The New Yorker, I respect, but I don't turn to it with the same hunger as I turn to New York. But what's happened now is, first of all, I think it would be a healthier world if we were still getting our information mediated by the gatekeepers.
That's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah,
if you trust the gatekeepers.
Well, but everybody has their own gatekeepers. Everybody's always had their own bubble and their own.
Right.
I never read the National Review, but the a la carte reality that's served up on social media and that thing called SOTNet, that sort of conspiracy theory website.
Right.
And people are filling their heads with just garbage from all over the place that isn't real stuff. There's a real value to reporting. Yes, those New York Times reporters were very self-important people. It's because they worked so hard and because they'd been put through such hell to get to where they were.
Well, there's also, it's been in the last few years, a political, strategy of just throwing mud on everyone so that everybody questions everything.
Yeah, and yes, and for the clicks, throwing the mud. Well, is it so that everyone questions everything? Is that a political strategy, or is it a capitalist strategy to simply get the most attention by covering the noisiest?
Well, you're using social media to your benefit, especially when you're marketing a book.
Well, I mean, who thought this quickly you'd have a president of the United States who only communicates by Twitter? I mean,
that's right.
But this thing is exponentially fast.
Right.
Yes.
It's and again, because it's unmediated, there's all this garbage. It's funny as a result of the Ava situation. Scott, to bring in the book, there's this chapter about a girl who was an Austrian model who was my roommate in New York when I was 20 years old, and she was the third person in my apartment to die in less than a year, which threw me into a state of trauma and horror. And when I went back to London, I left New York forever, I thought, went back to London, and I was so horrified by these 3 deaths. I didn't know what to do. I didn't go to a shrink. I went to the Spiritualist Association of Great Britain. And I went and studied with these mediums because I thought that would help me figure it out. And the most interesting thing, that one of the mediums taught me 2 really important things. One is that the primary feeling, the primary thought must always be kindness. And 2, don't mess about with the Ouija board because all kinds of filthy, awful fish come through. So I sometimes think of social media as the Ouija board with the trolls and all the demons.
That's a very interesting way to look at it, for sure.
I'm so glad you get it.
I get it. Let me ask you, I want to jump to something else for a second here.
Yeah.
At one point earlier in the book, you said you saw the world divided between action and audience. I thought that was a fascinating statement. Do you still feel that way?
Well, I think in a way more and more, but I learned so much when I started acting again. I learned so much about what that really is, and I'd love to talk about that in a minute. But action and audience, social media has made everybody potentially a star. You know, it brings attention to you. So everybody's an actor, everybody's a star, and look at the reality star who's now
the president.
Yeah.
Well, Joan, it's interesting because the social media has really been a great outlet for you to help promote the book. But are you able to carry on a dialogue with your audience through it?
Yeah, what's happening with social media, when I started going on Facebook and Twitter, for me, it was very simple. I don't have a magazine right now. I want to review this. I want to talk about that. And so for years, until I was promoting the book, I would talk about everything that interested me. And I thought of it as my own magazine.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, because she's her own brand.
Right, exactly.
You're your own brand.
What I found...
Well, I don't think... I mean, thinking of oneself as a brand is, I think, like a really slippery slope, you know. Next thing you'll be doing is shrink-wrapping yourself, putting yourself in vending machines.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things interesting about the book, I kept writing down little notes to myself. Not even for the interview, but just to ruminate on later. I was looking at whether some things that profound and interesting people said to you at certain points in your life were still valid later on in your life. For example, one of the other ones that stood out to me was that Tom Wolfe told you the most important thing in the world was status.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think about that? Advice.
I think for Tom Wolfe, it's definitely status, and Tom Wolfe writes about status, absolutely brilliantly. He made it his brand. He made it his subject.
But you were a young, impressionable girl at the time when he says that to you.
Oh yes, and I found it peculiar because I used to ask grown-ups these profound questions and hope for profound answers, and this was not a profound answer. And I realized that this man that I had a major crush on was saying something that I found kind of flip and kind of empty, and I hoped that maybe he was being bitter. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. But he also said about you, which I thought was a brilliant turn of words, he described you as starved to near perfection. Which for a model, or somebody that was modeling at the time or was in that role,
I described another girl as starved to near perfection. That was my description.
Well, that's a fantastic description.
Yeah, because I starved myself once when I was, living in New York, being a baby fashion assistant, and I was on the multicolored diet pills of Jerome Comet Klein. And I was there's that whole bit in the book where I keep losing weight, and it starts at 138, and it goes down
that was
to
very
101.
funny.
Yeah, and then I go, 115, 118 ish.
So you've over the years interacted, at various levels of intensity with many famous people, some of which have passed on, but some that are still alive. Do you have contact with, like Peter O'Toole?
He's dead.
I know, but I mean later on in life, after he and your father weren't partners anymore, did you run into him?
I didn't. Good question. I didn't see him for 33 years after the day that he came over to tell me Dad was crazy and
yes,
recite Ariel's song to me. And then his daughter, who's remained a friend, who was put on my bed in her, carrying basket when I was 11, and she was just born. But Kate came to New York with Peter, and we had dinner at Elaine's, and Peter was, pretty much Peter, and it was very tender and sweet to see him again. And then when he died, I went to England, and I went to the wake and the funeral. And Peter O'Toole was in a wicker coffin.
Wow.
And the lid of the wicker coffin was leaning against the window pane behind him, and it was open coffin, and it was an Irish wake. And his cat, called Sydney, which was what my cat had been called, was sitting on his chest. And people would come up to him, the mourners, the friends, mostly Irish, everybody, into the whiskey. And they'd come, and they would be so moved to see Peter, to see the corpse of Peter, but they wouldn't dare touch him. So they would they would stroke the cat that was sitting on.
That's a bizarre scene in my mind. I just visualizing that.
And I was sitting. I don't drink. I mean, I never really drank, and I'm sitting there with another woman who was the widow of the man that Peter's wife had left him for. Anyway, it was a long, complicated relationship there. And this woman and I are sitting there smoking cigarettes, drinking soda water next to the coffin, saying to people, "Don't touch the cat."
That's a little bizarre. But I do have to ask something. In the book, it stood out to me. You know, you met Peter O'Toole at the time right before he did Lawrence of Arabia.
Yeah.
You know, and he became a huge star.
Yeah, a couple of years before. Yeah.
Right, and he was in that. I mean, the word that's consistently used to describe him in that period of time is dashing, right? And did you find him that way at that point in his life? Was he a dashing character?
I found him just absolutely magical because he was good at playing. So I remember the first Christmas, which was a few years before Lawrence, he gave me these very long pencils. The pencils were about 2 feet long, and we'd fence with the pencils. And once in a while, if I was making too much noise and we were walking along the street, my parents, Peter, Sean, he would just pick me up and put me in a garbage can, which I also thought was terribly funny. So I found him, you see, I'm really thinking because it's coming to me in French. He was démesuré, which means without measure.
Right.
He was excessive.
So
and
let's do a quick
wonderfully excessive.
Yeah.
And then when I went to the premiere of Lord Jim with him, and he was in white tie and tails, and he was blonde, and he was gorgeous, and we went in the Daimler, and I just, even though at that point I'd known Peter for, 8 years or something, I was just holding my breath. I couldn't believe who I was sitting next to.
Right, he was a real movie star.
He was a real movie star. He was, yeah.
Yeah, he's a real. So look, our guest is Joan Juliet Buck. The name of the book is The Price of Illusion on Atria Books. You're listening to What Do You Know on KGVO.
So of all the movies, you also are a movie critic as part of your writing stuff. What movie of his, if someone wanted to see the definitive Peter O'Toole movie, is it Lion in Winter? Is it Lawrence of Arabia? Is it something later? Which one would you think?
I think it has to be Lawrence. I mean, the films that Peter O'Toole and my father made together were, they were worthy and they were good, and God Knows What's New Pussycat is one of the funniest films ever.
Yes.
But for the Peter O'Toole who just takes your breath away, it's Lawrence of Arabia.
Right, and he was in his 20s, right, when he did that role?
He was, let me see, he was probably 28, 29, 30. It was dazzlingly beautiful.
Well, it was a difficult role, and I mean, that movie, took 2 years to make? I mean, that was a long take.
It took 2 years. There was a very long time in Jordan, and then they moved to southern Spain. And it was difficult. I mean, he was not he had the physicality of actors, so he could fall down easily. He could tumble and all that, but he wasn't a sportsman. And him on the back of a camel, there was quite a lot of camel training. And then occasionally Peter would come back from the set of Lawrence of Arabia. So this is, 1961. I remember him coming to my parents' house one day, and there was nobody there. And he'd just come back, and he wanted some soup, and he was with this guy who'd been a fixer or something in Jordan. And he came and he said, "This is shufti." And, of course, shufti sounded like shifty to me. And he said, "This is shufti. Will you make us some soup?" I was 12. So I opened a couple of cans of soup. I wasn't quite sure what I was doing. And it was the first time I'd seen the blonde hair.
Yeah.
And there were many, long monologues about camel saddles and the smell of a camel and what it's like when the camel stands up.
Right.
And,
because before that, he had curly black hair, right? And then he became the blonde.
He had curly black hair and a bent nose.
Right.
And people still talk about Peter O'Toole. I saw Brian Cox, that wonderful actor.
Great actor.
The other night, and Brian was talking about Peter at Bristol. He never saw Peter at the Bristol Old Vic, but he said that Peter O'Toole, as a really young actor at the Bristol Old Vic, that was the greatest acting anybody had ever seen.
Wow, yeah, he always stood out. Even in movies later on, when he did, My Favorite Year, and he did, he did the Alan Swan role, which was the Errol Flynn thing. He stole the movie from everybody else.
Well, he was unbelievably magnetic, and then there was the he always wanted to be doing theater.
Mm-hmm.
So my father would produce these movies for Peter to be in, and then Peter would say, oh, God, I remember after, I think it was after Beckett, which was basically him and Richard Burton, what did he say? He said, oh, let's do a movie with some nice, soft ladies in it. so they found this script by a young comic called Woody Allen, his first script,
right.
and they
What's
made What's New Pussycat.
Exactly.
And then they did How to Steal $1 Million, which is also a wonderful movie.
Mm-hmm.
But then he did Hamlet, and he was directed by Laurence Olivier, and it was at the National Theatre, and the stage was very, very raked. And Peter and Laurence Olivier, I don't really know how well they got on because I was a school kid, but Peter O'Toole's imitation of Laurence Olivier always started, "Chaos is come again."
That's great. Let me move on to somebody else that is alive and very active and vibrant now, that you had a relationship with and maybe still do. That's what I was asking about, is Jerry Brown, governor of California now.
I haven't seen Jerry in years, but I am so proud of everything he's doing.
He's had one of the most remarkable careers of any American public figure.
Yeah.
All the different roles, governor, mayor,
mayor of Oakland.
Mayor of Oakland,
head of the DNC.
Yeah, back being governor again. All of it.
What is extraordinary, I think Jerry Brown is one of the few people I've known of whom I can say they really lived up to their potential.
Well, I noticed in the book that when you were having conversations with him, his interests were always very insightful in wanting to, drill down and not just have superficial discussions about things.
Exactly, the opposite of a banker.
Exactly.
And this is why I was so entranced by Jerry Brown, and why I'm just still, it's not, I wouldn't call it entranced, but I'm dazzled by what he's done in California, because everything that made people make fun of him the first time around, Governor Moonbeam,
right, making exactly. Everything he advocated for there was talked about the environment. They made fun of him, now it's,
and he was completely right.
He was right.
And now he's been able to put his ideas into practice, and it is the most functioning state in our country.
Right.
And this man has never sold out. This man has never betrayed his ideals. He's gone on redefining his ideals.
Right. So I was gonna pop over to Angelica Houston for a second.
Yeah.
So John Huston was your godfather, and Angelica, since she was a little girl. Do you still see her, talk to her?
We're still terribly close. I have two semi-sisters. One is Angelica, and one is her younger sister Allegra, who is much in the book.
Right. Both of them.
And I'm not a Houston, but those are my two semi-sisters. And then Angelica, I see whenever we happen to be in the same city, or I'll go out to L.A. to stay with her. And she'll come and stay with me in New York, unless she stays with somebody in a skyscraper. But sometimes the skyscraper starts swaying, and she'll call up and say, "Can I stay with you?"
That's beautiful. Joan, for the benefit of our listeners, give us a little color and describe your parents a bit, your mom and your dad. Because I think that'd be helpful.
What was that about helpful?
I think it'd be helpful for our audience to know of your parents.
So, my parents are, it's my mother, it's an American Jewish story. My mother was born in Chicago. Her parents had money and then didn't have money. When I look at the census, They always had a maid. But they so didn't have money that at one point when she was 9 years old, she had to go on stage to support the family. At least that's how the story went. And she was extraordinarily beautiful and was cast in a play called Franklin Street with the young Betty Persky, who would soon be Lauren Bacall, when she was 16 and Betty was 17. And so they were both these young actress models, but Lauren Bacall had this sort of fashion-y look, and my mother looked exactly like the girl next door, although more beautiful. My father is a really interesting story because his father was born in a covered wagon and might have been half Native American.
Is that right?
But it's difficult to check it out, but it's a family legend. And if you can imagine this rather, my great-grandfather had immigrated from Hamburg, but he was sort of a bad guy. He cheated on land races and watered the milk in St. Louis. And, my grandfather was born in this covered wagon. And then they ended up in St. Louis, where my great-grandfather was watering the milk, and then they moved to New York, and my father had this perfect eye. He was not handsome. He had an aesthetic sense that was very, very strong, and he was a very good photographer. He started out taking photographs of notables arriving on the liners at the docks on the west side of Manhattan when he was 14 years old in school, and never finished school, and went out to Hollywood as a 17-year-old to become a photographer for Esquire magazine and for Dell Publications and Photoplay, and he would photograph stars at play. And then when the war happened, he joined up as a cameraman, and he shot 2 documentaries with John Huston. And then in the late 40s, when the witch hunt started against the supposed communists in Hollywood,
right.
Both my father and John Huston joined the Committee for the First Amendment that said we have a right to believe what we want to believe,
right.
Which then, unfortunately, the communists confessed to the House Committee, and the people who'd been on the Committee for the First Amendment were labeled liberal patsies.
Right.
And the liberal patsies, many of them moved to Europe because,
right.
My father and John Huston made a film called We Were Strangers that was set in Cuba, that was about the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution hadn't even begun to happen. This was 1951. It was, but they made this film together. There was John Garfield in it and Jennifer Jones, and then nobody could make any films that were interesting or that had any subject.
Sure.
Everything had to be Lassie or Happy Family nonsense. So my mother went off to Europe in 1951 with my grandmother and my godmother, who had written Rebecca for Alfred Hitchcock, and who became Alfred Hitchcock's producer. My mother goes off to Europe, has a wonderful time, comes back to Hollywood, and says to my father, "Darling, we don't have to put up with this. Let's go live in Paris."
That's
and
fantastic.
Off they went.
You really are. Look at this. She's the product of her 2 parents. Her father was more of a reporter and a journalist and a documentarian.
I see a movie in the future.
I do too, Joan. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with the final segment with Joan Juliet Buck. The book is The Price of Illusion on Atria Books. Back after this. Okay, we are back with our guest, Joan Juliet Buck.
We'd be a little remiss not talking about this whole fashionista fashion world. You were in the midst of all of it, working for every, Vogue among others.
Yeah,
and in fact, one of the quotes that really stood out to me was in the book. It said, "Fashion was a game that true players didn't take seriously." So what is serious or not serious about the fashion industry these days?
Well, actually, that quote is about the fashion icons like Inez de la Fressange or Lulu de la Falaise, who everybody's photographing, but they you know, they're not fussing about what they're wearing. It's just instinctive. But but actually, people take the fashion world deadly seriously right now, and that's why it's actually so boring. Because fashion is supposed to be fun, and you know, it's a very big business, and it's not that much fun. I don't know. I have one friend who's a designer, two friends who are designers: Pamela Barish in L.A. and Zach Posen in New York. But otherwise, I don't go near that world anymore. It's, you know, not interesting.
But the time that you were heavily involved in it, when you had, you know, wasn't it Halston who designed your wedding dress?
Karl Lagerfeld.
Karl Lagerfeld, and then the dress end up in a museum? You have a dress in a museum?
Yeah, I have a few things in a museum. You know, you give your clothes to the museum, and then they let you eat in the dining room for a year. With the trustees.
So I do have to ask you about the Assad article, the Asma Assad article that you wrote, and you got some terrible heat for it. What happened there? What's your take on that?
I wrote a piece in Newsweek in 2012 saying exactly what happened, which is that on the 1st of December 2010, an editor at Vogue called me and asked if I wanted to go interview the First Lady of Syria. And I said, are you out of your mind? I don't want to meet those people, and they don't want to meet me. They don't want to meet any Jews. And, oh, no. And then I said, send a political reporter. No, we want this to be about the archaeological sites in Syria and the excavations that the Louvre is going to be doing in Syria. And one of the things I'm almost as passionate about as I am about color is antiquity. I thought I would see Palmyra. I knew I would never go to that country otherwise, and at that point, apart from whatever they were doing in secret, there was nothing going on in Syria. A lot of people were trying to buy palaces in Aleppo. It was like the next destination for the banker set. And so I agreed to go against my will. I gave myself massive flu. The doctor said, "Do you want a letter?" I said, "No, I've accepted the assignment. I'll go." I went. There were, two people watching over me at all times, minimum. The First Lady of Syria had once been a banker, so her interview was completely on message. And I never got to see Palmyra because she showed me a youth center.
Right.
And I came back. The Arab Spring started in late December 2010, intensified through January while I was writing the piece. I kept saying to Vogue, this is not the moment. Let's hold off on it. But because I'm a little French schoolgirl, and not a diva. If I'd been a diva, I'd have said, you know what, I don't want to write this. I'd have gone with my instinct.
Right.
But instead, I did my homework.
Right.
I did the piece.
You wrote the piece, and it was up to the editor to publish it or not publish it.
Well, they made me rewrite it 4 times to please them.
Well,
and I did, and then they put it online at the end of February. None of the atrocities had started.
Right.
It was only after mid-March. So this piece was up for 3 weeks. It was already being attacked because the title was A Rose in the Desert, and there was a very pretty picture of her.
Right.
And a lot of people thought that Syria shouldn't be in vogue. When Assad began murdering his people 3 weeks later, a month later, and then it just grew and grew, and the Internet, the world of trolls, the underworld of gremlins and anonymous haters, attacked me for everything Assad did.
Right.
Vogue gave me no more assignments for the rest of the year, although I was a contract writer. That's how you do it. They pay you and give you assignments, and you do them.
Right.
They gave me no more assignments, and then they said, you haven't fulfilled your assignments. You haven't fulfilled your contract, so we're letting you go.
Wow.
A setup.
Yeah,
is what it was.
Totally. I want to end on a little bit more positive note than this, Joan. So you actually the late great Leonard Cohen, is no longer with us, and he you and he had a relationship, and at one point you turned down his request to travel with him, and he sent you a note that said, "Never lie to a great poet or even a minor one."
Yes.
So did
it's
you?
A poem.
Did you see him as a great poet, not a minor one?
I see him as a great poet. At that time, what's interesting, if you think of the... Oh, by the way, you should read my piece in Harper's Bazaar, March issue, about Leonard Cohen.
I will, for sure.
Because there was too much Leonard Cohen in the book, and he wasn't part of the story of me and my father and the price of illusion. So
right.
it's in Harper's Bazaar.
Great.
But in 1972, Leonard Cohen was a little embarrassing because he was so sincere. And he was Jewish.
Right.
And he didn't have long hair. So he wasn't fashionable.
Mm-hmm.
And what's so interesting, again, it's a bit like Jerry Brown, these men that I have totally, totally adored, unconditionally. As he grew older, and as various things happened in his life, he grew more and more into being himself and expressing his talent more fully, and fashion turned, and then people were able to see him. And the last few years of concerts that Leonard was giving, the concerts would last 2.5, 3 hours. He would give everything.
Everything he had, yeah.
And in his 70s, he would get down on one knee. Did you see any of those concerts,
yes.
Scott?
Mm-hmm.
I definitely did.
Yes.
Remember the Beacon concert?
Oh, yeah.
And he got down on his knee, and he's singing, and he's like 75 years old.
He played the Beacon, the Garden, and Radio. I want to say he played all three of our
venues.
Yeah,
he played all three. But you know the weird thing, because he always, he always got me into his concerts, etc. There was always somebody giving me tickets from him, but he wouldn't see anyone when he was doing those tours because of how much it took out of him. When I saw him at Madison Square Garden, I was pissed off that there were so many people in the audience. Because at the Beacon, it was intimate.
Yeah, Garden can't be intimate.
The Garden, it was like, this is my Leonard, and there's like, how many?
20,000.
Yeah, 20,000.
Yeah, 20,000 people. It's too many.
It is incredible.
Okay. Lastly, you talk about the men that have profound effect on your life. Yeah. The part about Donald Sutherland, what was it about Donald Sutherland that got to you so deeply?
You know, what interests me in men is intelligence, intensity, and vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
And he's got all three things.
Do you still have any contact with him at all?
No, I haven't seen him in years. Furthermore, the context, it's Italy, it's the mid-'70s, bombs are going off, there are kidnappings. Whenever there's a demonstration, it turns into a riot and people are getting shot at. Bertolucci was making 1900, a film about the rise of socialism.
Sure.
And so and it was very foggy. So it was one of those moments in life when you can't really tell the difference between fantasy and illusion and reality. Oh. Fact and fiction are all kind of mixed up together.
Right.
As one.
That's a good way to describe it. And you and he were right in the middle of that.
Hey, Joan, I never asked you this. How did you meet Lou? We've never talked about that.
Oh, it's a wonderful story. I hope we have time for it.
Sure.
Okay. It's
Lou Reed we're talking about.
Lou Reed. It's December 2000. I have been relieved of my job at Paris Vogue. Robert Wilson, the director, says to me, and, a lot of people didn't know whether they should talk to me or not. I'm still in Paris. Robert Wilson says, you are my date for my opening night. And I go to the opening night of this thing that, poetry, that Lou did with him. And there's a dinner, and, Bob's got his arm around me the whole time. Then there's a dinner, and there's Lou sitting on the couch, and the dinner is, of course, at midnight. And the hostess says to me, Lou Reed is so grumpy, everybody's scared to go talk to him. Would you go over? So I go over. We start talking about science fiction books and fantasy. And I ask him if he's read Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials, the Amber Spyglass and all those books. And he's never heard of them, so he writes it down. And we have a very pleasant conversation. Again, because he's intense, intelligent, and vulnerable. I didn't fall in love with him, but I had a really great conversation. This is December 2000. In June of 2003, somebody takes me to the Tribeca Film Festival, and I've come in from, it's the opening night, and it's a very grand dinner at the courthouse downtown, and I'm not sitting with the guy who's brought me, and I've come in from New Mexico, and I don't like my table, and I think, I've come all the way from New Mexico for this, and I'm sitting by the kitchen with 7 people I don't know, and I just start wandering through the tables at this banquet, and I see Lou Reed, and I think, gosh, I wonder if he'd remember our conversation. And I kind of get within his eye line. I'm not going to go up to Lou, but I get within his eye line, and he notices me, and he says, "You were wrong about that book." Which is my opening to come over and say, right. What book? And he says, the Philip Pullman books. They're not science fiction. They're fantasy. I don't like fantasy. Sit down. There was an empty seat next to him, so I sat next to Lou. How about that?
That's a great story.
And that started a wonderful friendship that you had with him for the remainder of his life.
Yes.
Joan, you've been a delight. This has been fantastic.
This has been really fun.
We can go on for hours and hours. I got many more questions, but for our listeners, we'll do part 2. But they got to pick up The Price of Illusion, a memoir, and read it. It's fantastic, and it's it's written like there are these people describe the way you describe them. You describe them like characters, but they're all in a novel, but they're all real people, and that's what's so interesting about it.
Well, I'm also told that it reads like a thriller and a horror story.
Well, we'll get into that during the next time we talk.
I would admit.
But what's interesting, I love your reaction because men react to The Price of Illusion with the whole heart.
Yeah, it sucked me in from the first page, from the first sentence about Cottonwood. I was hooked.
Arnie binged on this. He did a binge read.
Yeah, I stayed up as late as I could reading it all literally I was writing notes. There was fantastic stuff in it all.
Oh, is there a second?
I'm hearing a lot of that. People send me, strangers send me messages at 7 a.m. I was up all night finishing it.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, and that doesn't happen very often anymore with books.
I'm so pleased. And thank you for having me on. This was lovely.
It was a pleasure.
Scott, would you please stay in touch? Absolutely. I want to hear everything.
You're great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to What Do You Know?
I can't wait for the next show, Scott.
I'm excited too, Arnie. If you'd like to suggest a guest, send me an email at scottrichman@townsquaremedia.com. We'll see you next week. And thanks for listening to Newstalk KGVO,